At exactly 7 o'clock on Thanksgiving night, my phone buzzed 41 times in under 8 minutes. I know the number because I sat there and watched every single one light up the screen. I was in my recliner, a plaid blanket over my knees, half a turkey sandwich on the side table, and the local news playing low in the background. My cat, Duchess, was curled up against my hip, more interested in sleeping than in the small earthquake happening 6 inches from her ear. One buzz, then two, then a cluster of them stacking on top of each other like dominoes falling too fast to count. My daughter, my son, my daughter-in-law, all three of them hammering at me at once. The strange part wasn't that they were calling. The strange part was that I'd been sitting here for the last hour, waiting for exactly this to happen, checking the clock every few minutes like a man waiting for a pot to boil. Have you ever spent decades being the answer to every problem in your family, only to become the problem yourself the one time you stopped? Have you ever given so much for so long that the giving itself became invisible until it was the only thing anyone noticed was missing? For 19 years, I paid for every single holiday my children and their families gathered for. The house rentals, the catering, the decorations nobody remembers ordering until the invoice shows up. And somehow, every single year, I was still the one who'd done something wrong. This year, I decided to stop. Not to argue about it, not to give a speech about it, just to stop. And at 7 o'clock that evening, the whole thing came apart at once. Before I explain why my phone nearly caught fire in my hand, let me ask you something, because I always like knowing who's out there listening to an old man tell his story. Where are you tuned in from tonight? I've heard from folks in every corner of this country, and it still surprises me every time. And here's another question for you, one I'd love to hear your answer to in the comments. Has your own family ever treated your generosity like it was owed to them? Like it stopped being a gift the moment they got used to it? Because what happened to me this Thanksgiving didn't start that night. It started 5 months earlier, in June, on a phone call I almost didn't answer. My wife, Margaret, passed 11 years ago. Cancer, the fast kind. The kind that doesn't give you time to prepare for the parts of life you're suddenly going to have to do alone. We'd raised 2 kids together, my son, Patrick, and my daughter, Colleen, and after she passed, the holidays became the one thing that still tied all of us together. I told myself that keeping the tradition alive was keeping her alive too, in some small way. So when Patrick suggested, that first Thanksgiving without her, that we rent a big house down in the Outer Banks so nobody would have to sit alone in a quiet kitchen missing her, I said yes before he finished the sentence. That first year was good, really good. We cooked together. We told stories about her. The grandkids ran on the beach in November jackets, and for a few days it felt like the family hadn't actually lost anything at all. But grief has a way of turning into habit, and habit has a way of turning into expectation, and expectation, I've learned, doesn't care one bit about gratitude. Every year the house got bigger. Every year the caterer's menu got fancier, more courses, more sides nobody finished, a raw bar the first year that nobody had asked me about beforehand. My granddaughter wanted a specific brand of boots one year. The next year it was a tablet, then noise-canceling headphones, then a purse with a designer name. I had to have my daughter-in-law spell out for me twice before I could find it online. Colleen had opinions about the linens. Patrick had opinions about the wine list. Every single year there was another cost waiting behind the last one, and every single year I paid it. Not because anybody thanked me for it, but because I told myself that keeping everybody together under one roof was worth whatever it cost. Here's the part that still sits heavy on me, even now. It was never the money that bothered me. It was how little gratitude traveled alongside it. If the drive down was long, I heard about it. If the weather turned, somehow that got laid at my feet too. If the turkey came out a touch dry one year because the caterer switched ovens on us at the last minute, you'd have thought I'd personally ruined the holiday on purpose. I told myself the first year, well, people are just stressed around the holidays. The second year, I told myself the kids would grow out of it once they had families of their own and understood what it costs to host people. By the 5th year, the 6th, the 10th, I stopped telling myself anything at all because nothing ever changed except the number at the bottom of the invoice. And somewhere in there, I noticed something that I couldn't unnotice once I saw it. Nobody ever called just to see how I was holding up. Nobody asked if I even wanted to go to the Outer Banks again, or if maybe, just once, I wanted a quiet Thanksgiving somewhere close to home, in my own kitchen, with nobody's schedule to coordinate but my own. They called to ask if the house was booked. They called to ask if the caterer had the seafood option this year. They called, in other words, to make sure the money was already moving. That was the moment something in me went cold and clear at the same time. They weren't excited to see their father. They were excited to see what their father had already paid for. And that realization, quiet as it was, planted the seed for everything that happened this year. Last Thanksgiving should have been the one where it all finally went right, or at least that's what I kept telling myself while I clicked confirm on one payment after another. The rental house alone ran me close to $6,000 for 4 nights. Then the caterer, then the wine, then the little things nobody plans for the firewood, the extra linens, the fee for early check-in because somebody's flight landed before noon. By the time everyone sat down at that long table looking out over the dunes, I'd spent just over $9,000, and honestly, the number wasn't what stung. What I wanted, plain and simple, was to watch my family enjoy each other's company for one evening without a single complaint finding its way to me. And for a few hours, I actually believed it might happen. The table was beautiful. The kids were laughing at the far end. My granddaughter kept sneaking rolls before dinner was even served, and I remember thinking, this is it. This is the one. I was wrong. After dinner, my son-in-law, Marcus, opened the gift I'd spent 2 weeks tracking down a set of golf clubs he'd mentioned twice in passing back in September. Expensive ones, the kind you have to special order and wait on. He unboxed them, ran his hand along the driver, smiled for maybe a full minute. Then he turned one club over, frowned, and held it up to the light. "Frank, is this used?" I told him it shouldn't be, that I'd bought it brand new from an authorized dealer. He turned it over again. "There's a scuff right here on the face. You paid full price for a used club." I told him I'd call the dealer Monday and get it sorted, that these things happen, that it was probably scuffed in shipping. That didn't land the way I hoped it would. "You spent all that money and didn't even check it before wrapping it?" The table went quiet in that particular way. A room goes quiet when everyone suddenly decided to watch you instead of eat. Before I could get another word out, Colleen leaned in from across the table. "Honestly, Dad, this is kind of on brand for you lately." I asked her what that was supposed to mean. She shrugged. The kind of shrug that isn't really a shrug at all. It's an accusation wearing a shrug's clothing. "You've been cutting corners on things. It's just noticeable." Cutting corners? After I'd just put over $9,000 into 4 days at the beach, nobody had asked me whether I could afford. Before I could answer that, Patrick's wife, Denise, added her own 2 cents from the end of the table. It's kind of become a pattern, honestly. Something always goes a little wrong. The words landed harder than I expected, not because they were new, but because I'd heard some version of that same sentence for close to 2 decades now, and something in me had simply run out of room to keep absorbing it politely. While they kept talking around me and over me, I looked at everything in that room. The rented china, the caterer's food still warm in its chafing dishes, the wine I'd picked out myself because Colleen liked a particular vineyard, the gifts still sitting under the little tabletop tree Denise had insisted on. Every last thing in that room I had paid for. And yet somehow I was sitting at the head of my own family's table feeling like a stranger who'd wandered in and picked up the check. Not a father. Not the man who used to carry these same kids on his shoulders at the beach 40 years ago. Just the fellow who covered the bill and occasionally got blamed when something wasn't perfect. The conversation moved on the way these things do. Somebody refilled the wine. Somebody put music on. The grandkids started chasing each other around the porch, and the whole ugly moment just dissolved into the evening like it had never happened at all, except it had, and I couldn't stop turning it over in my head. Later that night, after the kids had gone up to bed and the house had gone quiet, except for the ocean somewhere out past the dark, I sat alone on the back porch with a cup of decaf going cold in my hands. And for the first time in longer than I could remember, I didn't ask myself how to make next year's Thanksgiving go better. I asked myself a different question entirely. What would happen if I simply stopped? The answer arrived quiet and certain, the way real answers usually do, without any fanfare at all. Next year, they would get precisely what they'd actually paid for, which was nothing, because they'd never once reached for their own wallets to begin with. Before I tell you what happened next, I want to hear from you, because I think this is the kind of question that splits a room right down the middle. After a night like that one, after nearly 20 years of footing every bill and getting criticized for the trouble of it, would you have kept paying? Drop, keep paying, or walk away down in the comments, because once I made my decision that night on the porch, there was no talking myself back out of it. By the time June rolled around, I'd nearly convinced myself I'd let the whole thing go. The promise I made to myself on that cold porch back in November. Nearly. Then the family group chat lit back up, same as it did every single year around that time, months ahead of schedule, like clockwork nobody had ever needed to wind. It always started the same way, too. A few messages floating dates around, somebody mentioning the weather down south in November, and before a week had passed, the whole family was already halfway into planning a Thanksgiving that not one of them intended to pay a dime toward. The first message came from Colleen. She dropped a link to an even bigger rental this time, right on the water. 5 bedrooms, a hot tub on the deck. This one looks perfect for us this year, don't you think? Not, can we afford this? Not, what's your budget looking like this year, Dad? Just the same quiet assumption that had carried us through 19 Thanksgivings, without a single hiccup, that the tradition would simply continue, exactly as it always had. Because it always had. A few days later, Patrick started sending links of his own. Fishing gear, a new grill, a smartwatch for himself this time instead of for the grandkids. Every message read less like a wish and more like a receipt waiting to happen. Denise joined the thread not long after, focused entirely on the caterer. Could they get the same company as last year? Could they add a raw bar this time since everyone had loved the seafood? Could they upgrade the wine selection? Nobody in that entire group chat, not once, brought up who was actually going to be paying for any of it, because in their minds, that question had been settled a very long time ago. Me, as always. The old version of me, the one who'd been quietly writing checks for 19 years, would have jumped in right there and pushed back, maybe complained a little about the cost, maybe reminded everyone that money doesn't just appear because somebody wants a hot tub on a deck. This time, I did none of that. I didn't object. I didn't agree either. I simply let the messages pile up unanswered, the little blue counter climbing higher every day. And I said nothing at all. Weeks passed like that. Nobody seemed to notice my silence, or if they did notice, they read it the same way they'd always read it, which was to assume their father was quietly handling everything behind the scenes, same as always. Nobody asked. Not once did anyone type out, "Dad, are you good with all this?" Nobody checked whether I'd put the deposit down on the rental. Nobody wondered whether the caterer had actually been booked. Why would they? For 19 years, I had trained every one of them, without ever meaning to expect exactly this. Now I sat back and watched that expectation try to run itself, all on its own, with nobody at the wheel. As summer turned to fall, the reminder emails started rolling into my inbox right on schedule. The rental company wanted the deposit. The caterer wanted a head count and a signature. Final balances, due dates, polite little warnings about cancellation windows. I read each one, and then I closed it. No reply, no payment, no explanation offered to anyone. Meanwhile, while my children spent their evenings planning a Thanksgiving they fully expected their father to underwrite, I was quietly making arrangements of an entirely different kind. And unlike that beach house down in the Outer Banks, this particular reservation was actually going to get paid for, in full, by me. 10 days before Thanksgiving, I loaded up my truck, got Duchess settled into her carrier on the passenger seat, and pointed myself west, toward the Blue Ridge Mountains instead of the coast, toward a little town in the hills of North Carolina I'd read about once and never had the excuse to visit. Not the beach house, not the raw bar, not a rented mansion full of complaints wearing the costume of a family tradition. I found a small cabin outside of Boone, 1 bedroom, a wood stove instead of central heat, a porch that looked out over a valley that turned gold and rust-colored in the late afternoon light. It wasn't much by anybody else's standards. It was more than enough by mine. For the first time in 19 years, I'd booked a holiday built around what I actually wanted, instead of what everyone else had come to expect. That first day up in the mountains felt strange, if I'm honest with you. I kept waiting for my phone to buzz with some kind of complaint. Some last-minute crisis that would somehow, as it always had, land back on my shoulders to solve. Instead, there was only quiet. Good quiet. The kind that lets you actually hear the wind moving through bare trees instead of a television playing in the background just to fill the silence. The kind that lets a cup of coffee sit and go lukewarm because you're in no hurry at all to finish it. Duchess mostly slept in a patch of sun by the wood stove. I spent my days splitting a little kindling, walking the ridge trail behind the cabin, and slowly coming to understand just how tired I'd been for years without ever quite naming it. No expensive requests landing in my inbox. No arguments about linens or wine lists. No pressure. Just peace, plain and unearned, and entirely mine. After a few days up there, something struck me that I hadn't expected to feel. I wasn't missing the Outer Banks even a little bit. What I'd been missing, all those years, wasn't the trip itself. It was the idea of what I'd always hoped that trip could be. A family gathered together out of love instead of obligation. And somewhere along the way, without any single dramatic moment I could point to, that idea had quietly died, and I'd just kept paying the funeral costs every November regardless. Thanksgiving morning came in, clear and cold, frost on the porch rail, smoke curling up from a neighbor's chimney down the valley. I made myself a proper breakfast, took Duchess out for a bit of sun, watched a family 2 cabins down loading a folding table into the back of a pickup truck. It was, without a doubt, the most peaceful Thanksgiving I'd had in longer than I cared to count. But all through that day, I found myself checking my phone more than I meant to, not out of worry, because I knew something the rest of them didn't know yet. Certain deposits had never been made. A certain reservation existed only as an email thread nobody had bothered to finish. And sooner or later, somebody standing in a driveway down on the coast was going to find that out the hard way. So while my day moved along slow and quiet up in those mountains, I kept catching myself glancing at the clock on the mantel, because I knew, near enough to the minute, when reality was scheduled to come knocking. Thanksgiving afternoon up there couldn't have been more still. Duchess was curled by the stove. The valley outside had gone that particular shade of gold that only shows up for about 20 minutes, right before the light starts to fail. I had nowhere to be, and nothing left to organize. No head count to confirm, no menu to approve. For the first time in 19 Novembers, I wasn't managing a holiday at all. I was simply living inside one. Meanwhile, several states east, my family was making the same drive down to the coast they'd made every year since Margaret passed. I knew their schedule better than I knew my own these days. They always arrived by mid-afternoon. They always checked into the rental around 6 or 7 in the evening, and dinner always followed shortly after. 19 years, the same pattern, unbroken. This year was going to be different, and the only real question left was how long it would take any of them to figure that out. At exactly 7 o'clock, my phone lit up like a switchboard. The first call came from Colleen. I watched it ring, watched it stop. 5 seconds later, it rang again. Before that second call had even finished, Patrick's name appeared, then Denise's, then Colleen a third time. Within a couple of minutes, my screen had turned into something closer to an emergency alert than a phone. Call after call, text after text, voicemail stacking on voicemail. I set my coffee down on the little table beside the recliner and looked over the growing pile of notifications without picking a single one up right away. Right on schedule, more or less. The first text from Colleen read simply, "Call me. Now." The second one wasn't any gentler. "Dad, seriously, where are you?" A few minutes after that, Patrick sent something in all capital letters that I won't repeat word for word, but the gist of it was frustration, plain and loud. Denise's messages were a different flavor entirely. Confused first, then worried, then something closer to panic by the third or fourth text. I finally opened one of the voicemails, and the whole situation came into focus fast. The rental company had refused them entry at the door. The final balance had never gone through. No payment, no active reservation, no keys, no beach house waiting with the lights on. Around that same time, apparently, they'd also learned the caterer had canceled the order entirely, the deposit deadline having quietly come and gone weeks earlier, without a word from anyone. No caterer, no Thanksgiving dinner laid out and waiting, none of the carefully planned evening they'd been expecting. Just a gravel driveway, a stack of suitcases, and a reality nobody in that family had seen coming. The messages kept getting more frantic by the minute. Colleen wanted answers. Patrick wanted somebody, anybody, to blame. Denise wanted a fix, fast, before the kids got too cold or too hungry standing around outside. What struck me hardest, sitting there in my recliner 2 states away, wasn't that they were upset. It was that every single message assumed the exact same thing, that I would step in and fix it, same as I always had. Even now, even after months of silence on my end, even after not confirming a single reservation for the better part of a year, their very first instinct wasn't to solve the problem themselves, it was to call their father. For 19 years, I had rescued every holiday crisis before it ever had the chance to become visible to anybody but me. This time, there was nothing left to rescue. Only consequences, arriving right on schedule, exactly as I'd known they would. I could have picked up right then. I could have explained everything in about 30 seconds. I could have made a few calls, found them a hotel, salvaged something out of the wreckage of that evening, the way the old version of me would have done without even thinking twice about it. Instead, I got up out of my recliner and walked into the little kitchen. I poured myself a fresh cup of coffee, black, the way I've always taken it. Then I came back and sat by the window again. Outside, the valley had gone dark and quiet. A few porch lights scattered down the hillside. Inside, my phone kept buzzing itself in slow circles on the table. Call, text, voicemail. Call, text, voicemail. For once in 19 years, I didn't rush toward fixing a single thing. I just sat there with my coffee and let the silence between each buzz say what I no longer had the words or the energy to say myself. If you've ever had to learn the hard way that gratitude isn't something you can force into existence just by giving more, hit subscribe before my next story finds you, because there's always another one. And tell me down in the comments, honestly, what would you have done sitting in my chair that night? Would you have picked up right away, or would you have let them sit with it a while first? After close to an hour of calls stacking on calls, I finally answered. The second I picked up, Colleen started in before I could even say hello. Talking isn't quite the right word for it. Demanding is closer to the truth. Dad, where are you? What is going on? Why isn't the house ready? Before I could get a word in, Patrick's voice came through from somewhere nearby, tight and fast. This is unbelievable. We're standing in a parking lot in the dark. They're saying there's no reservation at all. Denise sounded worn thin by that point, closer to exhausted than angry. Frank, can you please just tell us what's happening? For a moment, I didn't say anything at all. Not because I didn't know what to say. Because it struck me that this was the first time all year any of them had sounded genuinely interested in hearing my voice, rather than my confirmation number. Once the noise on their end finally settled a notch, I asked one simple question. Did any of you pay the deposit on the house? Silence. So I asked another. Did anybody pay the caterer? More silence, longer this time. Then Colleen spoke up, quieter now. That's not really the point, Dad. I nearly laughed out loud right there in my recliner. Because that was exactly the point, the entire point, the only point that had mattered for the better part of 2 decades. I took a slow sip of my coffee and gave them the only answer I figured they'd actually earned. I figured whoever wanted the house would be the one paying for it. Silence again, complete this time. The kind of silence I hadn't heard out of that family in longer than I could remember. Nobody had a comeback ready. Nobody had a complaint loaded up and waiting. Because we all knew, every one of us on that call, that not a single person besides me had ever once expected to reach for their own wallet. I said something then that I probably should have said years earlier, sitting at some other table, some other Thanksgiving. I was never the one causing problems at these things. I was the one paying for them. Nobody interrupted me, and I think somewhere along the way, all of you forgot there's a difference. I told them how the holidays had slowly stopped being about family and started being about expectations, bigger ones every single year, with less and less gratitude riding alongside them. I told them I was tired, plainly and simply, of being treated like the trouble while I quietly funded everybody else's version of a perfect holiday. The call ended about the way you'd guess it would. Nobody apologized. Nobody said I'd been right to do what I did. A few sharp words got exchanged on both sides, and eventually the line went dead. But even with the call ending on a sour note, Something important had shifted, and I felt it the moment I set the phone down. For the first time in 19 years, that weight wasn't sitting on my shoulders anymore. The days after Thanksgiving stayed quiet, in their own particular way. At first, the texts I got weren't all that different from the phone calls had been. Some anger in them, some frustration, a few attempts to make me feel like the villain of the whole story. According to Patrick, I'd humiliated the entire family in front of the grandkids. According to Colleen, I'd manufactured a crisis just to make a point. Denise mostly stayed out of it, though she checked in once or twice, asking how I was doing up there in the mountains, whether I was warm enough, whether Duchess had settled in all right. That alone felt like something new. For the first time in longer than I could say, somebody in that family was asking after me, instead of asking me for something. As the weeks rolled on toward Christmas, the sharper emotions started to cool a little, the way they usually do once shock wears off and people are left standing in the plain light of what actually happened. The beach house hadn't fallen through because I'd sabotaged it. It fell through because not one person had taken responsibility for making sure it happened, and that's a distinction that matters. Whether or not anybody in my family was ready yet to say so out loud. By the time spring rolled around, something had shifted for good. Nobody sent links to oceanfront rentals. Nobody forwarded me a caterer's menu with little stars next to the expensive options. Nobody simply assumed, the way they always had, that Dad had it handled. That old expectation, built up over 19 years without anybody ever really deciding to build it, had finally cracked open and let some air in. Some things did grow more distant. I won't pretend otherwise. A few phone calls got shorter. One or two traditions just quietly stopped happening at all, and I felt that, more than I let on to anybody. But something else happened too, something I hadn't expected. The conversations that did keep happening started feeling like they actually meant something. When Patrick called now, he wasn't calling to float a rental listing my way. He was calling because he wanted to hear how I was doing, how Duchess was adjusting to cabin life, whether I'd gotten the wood stove figured out yet. Those calls weren't frequent, but they were real. And I'll take one honest phone call over 100 polite requests, dressed up as love, any day of the week. Looking back on it now, the best Thanksgiving I've had since Margaret passed wasn't the one with the biggest rental house or the fanciest raw bar. It wasn't the one with the golf clubs or the 5-bedroom place on the water. It was the quiet one, up in the mountains outside Boone, just me, an old cat asleep by the wood stove, and a peace of mind I hadn't felt in nearly 2 decades. The one where I wasn't spending the whole day trying to earn approval I'd never once actually been owed in the first place. The one where nobody had a single thing to blame me for, because there was nothing left in that cabin that anyone else had a claim to. Most folks think generosity means saying yes to everything, forever, without ever asking for anything back. I've come to believe, later in life than I probably should have, that real generosity has to come with boundaries built right into it. Or it isn't generosity at all, it's just a habit somebody else has learned to rely on. Because the moment kindness turns into an expectation, gratitude has a way of quietly walking right out the back door without anybody noticing it's gone. And sometimes the healthiest thing an old man can do is sit back in his own recliner, let the phone buzz itself out on the table, and let the people he loves carry a little weight that was never really his to carry alone in the first place. 7 o'clock didn't ruin anybody's Thanksgiving. It just finally showed me, plain as daylight, who thought that holiday had belonged to me all along.